Good morning, everyone. So, last time, we embarked on our journey into Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, specifically diving into Chapter 1, Prejudices of Philosophers. Remember? We touched on those initial, shall we say, provocations from Nietzsche about the will to truth, that unquestioned drive, and the often invisible assumptions that prop up so much philosophical inquiry. Today we plunge into Aphorism 5. And this, my friends, is where Nietzsche really turns up the heat. He shifts gears, moving from a general, almost abstract questioning of truth's ultimate value to a direct and, frankly, pretty biting cross-examination of philosophers' motives, their claims to intellectual honesty. Think about that. This isn't just a critique. It has profound meta-philosophical implications for how we understand the entire philosophical game, the whole enterprise. This single aphorism, you see, is a powerhouse. It's a concentrated blast of Nietzsche's broader project, the famous revaluation of values, and a deep, unsettling critique of traditional metaphysics and morality. He's not just poking holes. He's aiming to expose what he views as their psychological and, yes, prejudicial underpinnings. And how does he do it? Masterfully. He employs several philosophical methods we'll be unpacking today. Psychological critique, what we call genealogical unmasking, and a sharp rhetorical analysis. But, as we'll discover, this aphorism isn't just a weapon Nietzsche wields. It also contains elements that demand our careful, critical engagement as scholars. We need to look closely at some of Nietzsche's more polemical characterizations and, crucially, his own awareness, or perhaps lack thereof, of his own methods. Nietzsche kicks off Aphorism 5 with a truly striking assertion, doesn't he? He goes right for the jugular, addressing the source of our, or at least his, unease with philosophers. He writes,
"What goads us into regarding all philosophers with an equal measure of mistrust and mockery is not that we are struck repeatedly by how innocent they are, how often and easily they err and stray, in short, their childish childlikeness, but rather that there is not enough genuine honesty about them, even though they all make a huge, virtuous racket as soon as the problem of truthfulness is even remotely touched upon."
Wow. Notice the immediate rhetorical punch there. He's not saying our mistrust and mockery stem from philosophers just getting things wrong. Their innocent or childish childlikeness, as he puts it. No, not at all. Instead, the core issue, the real sticking point, is a perceived deficit, not enough genuine honesty. Now, the German term here, Ehrlichkeit, it's so much richer than just telling the factual truth. It implies a profound intellectual integrity, a rectitude, almost an existential candor, a kind of soul-deep honesty. Its absence, therefore, isn't merely an epistemological slip-up. It's a deep-seated character flaw. And this distinction, it's absolutely crucial. It's not about them making mistakes. We all do that. It's about a fundamental lack of this profound integrity in how they present their pursuit of truth. And doesn't this immediately echo our earlier discussions about the philosopher's supposed disinterestedness? That lofty, unalloyed value of the will to truth. Here, Nietzsche drops a bombshell. This very truthfulness they parade, he suggests, is often just performative, a huge virtuous racket. Boom. Now, that generalization, all philosophers. That's a sweeping statement, isn't it? And this itself, as scholars frequently point out, creates a fascinating interpretive tension. Here's Nietzsche making a universal claim, a generalization that could, itself, be seen as a kind of prejudgment, the very thing he's about to skewer. So, what is it? An empirical observation? Or a provocative opening gambit designed to shake us up, to unsettle our comfortable assumptions.
Nietzsche then digs deeper, elaborating on the specific nature of this alleged dishonesty. He claims,
They all act as if they had discovered and arrived at their genuine convictions through the self-development of a cold, pure, divinely insouciant dialectic, in contrast to the mystics of every rank, who are more honest than the philosophers and also sillier. They talk about inspiration. Well, what essentially happens is that they take a conjecture, a whim, an inspiration, or, more typically, they take some fervent wish that they have sifted through and made properly abstract, and they defend it with rationalizations after the fact.
This is a pivotal passage. It outlines what Nietzsche sees as the fundamental deception at the heart of philosophy. The public face? Oh, that's the cold, pure, divinely insouciant dialectic, and you can just hear the heavy irony dripping from Nietzsche's words. He conjures up this idealized image of dialectic. Think Plato, think Hegel, only to immediately smash it against the rocks of what he alleges are the psychological realities. He's subverting its revered status as a methodical, objective path to discovery. But behind this glittering facade, Nietzsche argues, lies a very different story. A story of conjecture, a whim, an inspiration, or, even more damningly, a fervent wish that is then meticulously dressed up in logical, rational-sounding clothes. This fervent wish, this pre-existing conviction, is sifted through and made properly abstract, and then defended with rationalizations after the fact. Think about that. One might even pause here and consider, as some feminist philosophers compellingly argue, how such fervent wishes could be deeply connected to embodied, affective experiences often dismissed or marginalized in traditional philosophical discourse. Understanding this dynamic that Nietzsche claims to expose is absolutely key to grasping his entire approach. He's inviting us, challenging us, to read philosophy not just for its surface logic, but for these hidden genealogies of ideas. A method that demands a certain kind of interpretive depth, almost like an archaeology of thought. Digging, always digging. And right here, we see the first clear, powerful instances of two of Nietzsche's signature methods. First, psychological critique. He's not just refuting arguments, he's analyzing philosophical claims by probing the alleged underlying psychological motivations and processes of the philosopher. He's asking, what really drives the construction of these grand, elaborate philosophical systems? This approach doesn't just add a psychological layer, it elevates psychological inquiry to a primary tool for understanding philosophy, directly challenging the traditional, almost sacred, primacy of logical analysis alone. Second, and deeply intertwined with this, is genealogical unmasking. Genealogy, in this potent Nietzschean sense, isn't just tracing a family tree. It's digging into the birth story, the often hidden ancestry of an idea. Instead of just looking at an idea as it presents itself, all polished and pristine, Nietzsche demands, where did it really come from? What were its less glamorous, perhaps even embarrassing, ancestors, or its hidden, self-serving motivations before it got all dressed up and paraded as a formal, objective truth? This passage explicitly, powerfully, contrasts the presented origin story, the noble dialectic, with a claimed actual origin story. Whim, wish, prejudice, all followed by after-the-fact rationalization. This is the core, the very heart of genealogical unmasking, and it's a frontal assault on the idealized image of the disinterested, purely objective philosopher. A shattering blow. The concept of rationalization is absolutely central here. It's that all-too-human process
of creating seemingly logical, perfectly sound reasons for beliefs that were actually arrived at through other, often unacknowledged, perhaps even unconscious means. This prefigures, in a truly striking way, Freudian concepts of unconscious motivation, doesn't it? Indeed, Nietzsche's unmasking of these hidden drives, these unconscious motivations and the defense mechanisms of the ego, like rationalization, resonates so deeply with what Freud would later develop far more systematically. We might also, if we listen closely, hear echoes of the Frankfurt School's critique of instrumental reason, where thought, even lofty philosophical thought, ends up serving pre-existing interests. Even if, in Nietzsche's case, these interests are primarily psychological, rather than socio-economic. And another intellectual echo, a faint whisper perhaps, we might detect, is that of Schopenhauer. Nietzsche's radical idea that fervent wishes, the will, in a very Schopenhauerian sense, precede and actually direct the rationalizations of the intellect, is powerfully reminiscent of Schopenhauer's metaphysics. Remember, for Schopenhauer, the intellect is often portrayed as secondary to, and indeed a servant of, the blind, relentlessly striving will. Fascinating, isn't it? Now, before we move on, let's be clear. This provocative analysis has, quite naturally, sparked immense scholarly discussion. And rightly so. Nietzsche is essentially laying out an argument. Philosophers, premise 1, present their conclusions as the shiny products of objective dialectical reasoning. But, he counters, premise 2, the actual process involves defending pre-existing, subjectively derived convictions with justifications cooked up after the fact, post hoc rationalizations. The implied assumption here, the silent premise, is that genuine intellectual honesty, that Ehrlichkeit, would involve owning up to these subjective origins. This is a strong claim, a very strong claim. For instance, one alternative interpretation that scholars have wrestled with is whether philosophers are genuinely mistaken, not necessarily deliberately disingenuous. Perhaps they sincerely believe they are following a cold, pure dialectic, but are, in fact, unconsciously swayed by their biases, their hidden desires. Their innocence could be real, their errors stemming from a lack of self-awareness rather than a deficiency in honesty. The problem, then, would be more epistemological, concerning the very limits of self-knowledge, than ethical. And while Nietzsche does, of course, mention their childish childlikeness, his much stronger, more biting language throughout this aphorism seems to point towards a critique of a more conscious, or at least semi-conscious, disingenuousness. It also throws a boomerang back at Nietzsche himself, doesn't it? What fervent wish, we can't help but ask, drives his particular, relentless project of unmasking? Another way to approach this, perhaps a more charitable reading towards the philosophical enterprise itself, is to see this process, this taking of a fervent wish and making it properly abstract, not as inherently dishonest, but as the necessary intellectual labor of philosophy, the hard work of transforming a personal insight, an intuition, a deeply felt conviction, into a universally arguable, rationally defensible claim. The dialectic, then, doesn't disappear. It becomes the crucial tool for this transformation and for rigorously testing the abstracted claim against counter-arguments. From this perspective, philosophers aren't necessarily being liars. They're engaging in a standard, perhaps unavoidable practice of philosophical argumentation. Nietzsche's critique, then, might zero in more pointedly on the concealment of these origins, the pretense of pure objectivity, rather than on the process of abstraction itself. What do you think? Take a moment. Really reflect on this. If Nietzsche is right, if many philosophical ideas really do begin as fervent wishes, does that automatically invalidate them? Poof, gone? Or does the very process of abstracting them, of rationalizing them, potentially transform them into something more robust, more defensible, perhaps even more valuable. Nietzsche continues, relentlessly sharpening his critique of this lack of transparency, this alleged intellectual sleight of hand.
They are all advocates who do not want to be seen as such. For the most part, in fact, they are sly spokesmen for prejudices that they christen as truths, and very far indeed from the courage of conscience that confesses to this fact, this very fact, and very far from having the good taste of courage that also lets this be known, perhaps to warn a friend or foe, or out of a high-spirited attempt at self-satire.
You hear that? The lack of honesty now morphs into an active charge. These philosophers are sly spokesmen, cunning advocates for unacknowledged prejudices that they christen as truths. Prejudices. The German here is Vorurtheile, literally prejudgments. This term brilliantly emphasizes their status as foundational assumptions, as verdicts reached before the supposed cold, pure dialectic even gets warmed up, often operating entirely unawares, deep beneath the surface of conscious thought. And this is where premise 3 of his devastating argument slots into place. Philosophers, by and large, do not acknowledge these subjective, often prejudicial, origins. The conclusion, then, follows with a grim logic. Therefore, philosophers generally lack that profound, genuine honesty, and are, more often than not, merely sly spokesmen for prejudices. Genealogy, as a critical method, dedicates itself to precisely this task, tracing these acclaimed, revered truths back to their originating Vorurtheile. This act of christening prejudices as truths, what a powerful image. It also carries a distinct deconstructive resonance, doesn't it? It highlights the performative power of language in philosophy, the way words can conjure realities, and it subtly underscores the inherent instability of grand terms like truth itself. It radically, shockingly, shifts the very focus of philosophy, from being primarily a disinterested, noble quest for objective truth, to an activity deeply embedded in, and often cynically driven by, unacknowledged personal motivations and psychological needs. And here, it's almost impossible not to see a striking parallel, structurally at least, with another powerhouse critical tradition: Marxist critique of ideology. Just as Marx famously argued that the dominant ideas in any given society often cleverly reflect the material interests of the ruling class while being masterfully presented as universal, timeless truths, Nietzsche here suggests something analogous, that philosophers' so-called truths often serve to disguise underlying personal or psychological commitments, their own fervent wishes. But this passage isn't just about tearing down. It also introduces a positive value, a virtue that Nietzsche clearly, deeply esteems: the courage of conscience. Now, this isn't just about passively telling the truth. No, it's about the intellectual and moral fortitude to acknowledge one's own biases, to face the true, often messy, origins of one's ideas, and to be transparent, radically transparent about them. This injects an unavoidable ethical demand right into the heart of philosophical methodology itself. He even links this courage to the good taste of courage and the incredibly intriguing, almost playful, notion of a high-spirited attempt at self-satire. Imagine that. What might such self-satire look like for a philosopher? Perhaps an open, unblinking acknowledgement of the personal, even arbitrary, starting points of their thought. A radical, perhaps liberating, possibility for philosophy to incorporate a self-critical, ironic distance from its own often overblown claims to authority. Some readers, particularly those with a Straussian leaning, might detect in the phrase, perhaps to warn a friend or foe, a subtle hint towards an esoteric teaching, a hidden, more honest path for a select, courageous few who possess this rare intellectual bravery. And this raises a crucial question. Does this courage of conscience, if it's even attainable, offer a genuine way out of the seemingly deterministic, almost cynical, psychological account Nietzsche offers? This seems like a perfect moment for a brief thought exercise, doesn't it? Let's try to flex those Nietzschean muscles. He accuses philosophers of lacking the courage of conscience to admit their grand ideas often spring from prejudices or fervent wishes. So, can you think of a prominent philosophical concept, ancient or modern? Any big idea that comes to mind? Now, in a truly Nietzschean spirit, speculate. What unacknowledged fervent wish or deeply buried prejudice might have been its unacknowledged, hidden starting point? And then, how might it have been subsequently made abstract, polished up, and defended with rationalizations after the fact? This isn't about definitively psychoanalyzing long-dead historical figures, of course. It's about practicing, actively engaging him, the kind of sharp, critical questioning that Nietzsche himself models so provocatively. Having laid out his general, quite explosive, thesis, Nietzsche then pivots, turning to specific examples, starting with the formidable Immanuel Kant.
The stiff yet demure tartuffery used by the old Kant to lure us along the clandestine dialectical path that leads the way, or rather, astray, to his categorical imperative. This spectacle provides no small amusement for discriminating spectators like us, who keep a close eye on the cunning tricks of the old moralists and preachers of morals.
Kant, the architect of one of the most influential, most revered ethical systems in history, is accused of tartuffery. That's not a throwaway insult. It's a direct, loaded allusion to Molière's famous hypocritical character, Tartuffe, and it carries heavy connotations of feigned piety, sanctimoniousness, and a deeply deceptive moral posturing. Kant's method, Nietzsche claims, is a clandestine dialectical path, a phrase implying deliberate deception and misdirection, all designed to lure us, like unsuspecting prey, towards his categorical imperative. This is a prime example of Nietzsche deploying his powerful rhetorical analysis. He's not just disagreeing with the content of the categorical imperative itself. He's dissecting how Kant allegedly persuades us. The stiff yet demure style, the subtle, luring, clandestine path. Nietzsche frames Kant's entire philosophical performance as a Schauspiel, a spectacle, put on for unsee feineren Zuschauer, for discriminating spectators like us. See what he did there? This clever construction turns the philosophical critique into a kind of intellectual theatre, where the form, the spectacle of Kant's argument, and the content, Nietzsche's critique of Kant's method, become inextricably linked. And in doing so, he positions us, the readers, within a select, discerning audience, capable of seeing through the performance, of spotting the strings. This intense focus on persuasion, on rhetoric, is absolutely central to philosophy. Not just its propositional content, is a key and deeply unsettling Nietzschean challenge.
Why we need this Nietzschean challenge?
Nietzschean. This is also, unmistakably, an instance of psychological critique, as Nietzsche attributes a kind of cunning, a disingenuousness, to Kant's motivations. And while the language is undeniably harsh, almost brutal, it forces us to confront a difficult question. To what extent is the presentation of philosophical arguments always a strategic act? Of course, this dismissive, even contemptuous tone towards Kant can certainly be seen as a caricature, potentially, and some would say, unfairly, overlooking the immense complexities and sincere intellectual labor in Kant's monumental work. Nietzsche then, not missing a beat, offers another example: Spinoza.
Or even that hocus pocus of a mathematical form used by Spinoza to arm and outfit his philosophy, a term which, when all is said and done, really means his love of wisdom. And thus, from the very start, to strike terror into the heart of the attacker, who would dare to cast a glance at the unconquerable maiden and Pallas Athena. How much personal timidity and vulnerability this sick hermit's masquerade reveals.
Hocus pocus. Spinoza's renowned use of the mos geometricus, the geometric method, is derided as hocus pocus, mathematischer Form. Hocus pocus, a blatant term for trickery, for deceptive illusion. It's framed not as a rigorous path to clarity and truth, but as an intimidating, deliberately obfuscating facade. Und beobachten Nietzsche seine absolute Crucialparenthetica Redefinition von Philosophie in Bezug auf Spinoza. Ein Wort, mit dem man sich zuletzt billig übersetzt. Die Liebe zu seiner Weisheit. The standard English translation, his love of wisdom, certainly captures the possessive seiner, his. But it often misses the critical, biting edge of billig übersetzt, which might be more sharply rendered as one ultimately translates cheaply, or superficially as the emphasis on Liebe to seiner Weisheit, love of his own wisdom, is a devastating reinterpretation. It suggests that philosophy, far from being a universal love of wisdom with a capital W, is often, perhaps usually, a deeply personal attachment to one's own carefully constructed intellectual edifices. Spinoza's masquerade, for Nietzsche, might even resonate with a more contemporary, deconstructive interest in how form, in this case, mathematical form, attempts to guarantee or stabilize meaning, only to ultimately reveal its own constructed, perhaps even arbitrary, nature. Nietzsche's psychological critique here becomes even more pointed, more personal, and, let's be frank, deeply problematic. He attributes Spinoza's famously rigorous, systematic presentation not to a genuine pursuit of clarity or logical precision, but to personal timidity and vulnerability, cruelly calling him a sick hermit. Now, this is where we, as critical thinkers, must engage critically with Nietzsche himself. The ad hominem attack on Spinoza, sick hermit, is a stark, unsettling example of the potential pitfalls, the real dangers, of psychological critique when taken to such extremes. We might call it psychological reductionism. Such language, as you know, is widely considered inappropriate, even unethical, in contemporary scholarly discourse, precisely because it can derail substantive philosophical engagement by resorting to mere personal insult, to name-calling. It's worth noting here, from a historiographical perspective, that scholarly interpretations of Nietzsche's more aggressive, more polemical critiques, like this one targeting Spinoza, have themselves evolved dramatically over time. We've moved from early, often scandalized dismissals, or, conversely, uncritical, almost cult-like adoptions of his polemics, through Walter Kaufmann's pivotal reevaluations, which sought to contextualize and, to some extent, sanitize such outbursts. Then came the post-structuralist embrace of Nietzsche as a radical, indispensable critic of Western thought. And now, we're seeing more nuanced, sophisticated contemporary approaches. These newer readings often try to discern the genuine philosophical point, if there is one, hidden beneath the often inflammatory rhetoric, perhaps connecting such overtly psychological claims to Nietzsche's broader, if sometimes unevenly executed, interest in what he termed philosophical physiology, or to his foundational concept of perspectivism. When faced with such challenging, even offensive content, our task as scholars, as responsible readers, is to engage with intellectual honesty and, I would argue, with a certain intellectual humility. We absolutely should, indeed we must, acknowledge the problematic nature of the language. Full stop. We can then, cautiously, try to separate the ad hominem attack from any potentially valid underlying critique of Spinoza's method, if such a critique can even be charitably discerned beneath the vitriol. This difficult moment also provides a crucial opportunity for us to discuss Nietzsche's own rhetorical style. The polemical, provocative, often shocking language is undeniably part of his philosophical toolkit. But we must assess its effects, both those he might have intended and those he perhaps did not. And it compels us, once again, to ask that uncomfortable, self-reflexive question, by positioning us as these discriminating spectators, supposedly capable of seeing through all these philosophical masquerades. Does Nietzsche implicitly assume a privileged, unassailable epistemic position for his own perspective? A perspective that could, ironically, be subject to the very same genealogical unmasking he so expertly applies to others. What fervent wish, we might justifiably wonder, does this lofty position of the discriminating spectator fulfill for Nietzsche himself? This difficult passage, especially Nietzsche's rather brutal treatment of Spinoza, serves as a crucial, unavoidable reminder about the profound complexities and indeed the potential dangers of employing psychological critique in philosophy. What does it really mean to look at the mind, the personality, the alleged neuroses of the philosopher to explain why they came up with their ideas? Nietzsche is prodding us, asking, what personal needs, what hidden fears, what unacknowledged desires might be lurking behind Spinoza's famously austere, rigorously formal style? But we, as critical readers, as responsible thinkers, must also ask ourselves, is this approach, especially when pushed this far into personal attack, truly illuminating? Is it fair? And perhaps most importantly, does it ultimately tell us whether the philosophical idea itself is strong or weak, valuable or flawed? Thinking through these critical questions helps us to delineate not only the potential strengths, but also the very significant limitations of attempting to explain away a philosophical system, primarily by appealing to the author's psychology, especially when it veers so sharply into such deeply personal and frankly speculative territory. So, to wrap up our intensive look at this single explosive aphorism, Nietzsche launches an all-out broadside against what he perceives as the pervasive intellectual dishonesty of philosophers. He argues, quite devastatingly, that they skillfully disguise their subjectively derived Vorurtheile, those prejudgments, and their fervent wishes under the respectable, objective-seeming cloak of dialectic, all too often employing rationalizations after the fact to shore up their predetermined conclusions. He starkly contrasts this widespread practice with a passionate demand for the courage of conscience. His pointed examples of Kant and Spinoza are, in his view, intended to vividly illustrate this dynamic, though the latter, as we've seen, raises some very serious questions about Nietzsche's own methods and his sometimes problematic rhetoric. Throughout this deep dive into Aphorism 5, we've witnessed the development and deployment of several absolutely key Nietzschean concepts. Ehrlichkeit, honesty, understood not just as truth-telling, but as profound intellectual integrity. Vorurtheile, prejudice, exposed as the often unacknowledged, foundational source of many so-called truths. Dialectic, portrayed as an often feigned, idealized method, a performance rather than a genuine process of discovery. Rationalization, as the cognitive, often unconscious, work of defending these pre-existing prejudices, and, perhaps most inspiringly, the courage of conscience as the missing, yet desperately needed, virtue in philosophy.
These concepts aren't just defined. They are shaped, revealed, and given power through Nietzsche's relentless application of psychological critique, genealogical unmasking, and incisive rhetorical analysis.
And in doing so, he doesn't just critique individual philosophers. He fundamentally challenges the traditional, often rigidly maintained, boundaries between philosophical sub-disciplines.
Suddenly, epistemology becomes inextricably entangled with psychology. Ethics fuses with methodology, and metaphysics finds itself uncomfortably intertwined with rhetoric and even aesthetics. The philosophical landscape is forever changed.
We've also taken the time to consider some crucial alternative interpretations, haven't we?
Are philosophers genuinely mistaken, perhaps self-deceived, rather than consciously disingenuous? Is Nietzsche's fiery critique primarily a rhetorical provocation designed to shock us into thought, rather than a literal accusation? Or could it be that the process of abstraction and rationalization, even if it starts from a fervent wish, is actually a necessary, even valuable part of philosophical work, with the true fault lying only in the concealment of these origins, in the pretense of immaculate conception? These aren't easy questions with simple answers. Indeed, these questions force us to confront a much larger one. How might this single potent aphorism from Nietzsche transform our very understanding of what philosophy itself is, or perhaps what it should be?
So, as we move forward from this incredibly rich and challenging aphorism, having witnessed Nietzsche's no-holds-barred critique of the motives and methods of past philosophers, a compelling question, naturally, almost inevitably, arises. Having so thoroughly exposed the alleged tartuffery of Kant and the masquerades of Spinoza, and by implication, of so many others, what positive vision for philosophy, if any, might Nietzsche begin to sketch for us? Will he offer us a new path? Or will he simply continue, in the subsequent aphorisms, to dismantle other cherished philosophical idols, one by one, before even attempting to build anew from the rubble? This, my friends, sets the stage perfectly for our next discussion. What comes after the hammer? But before we conclude for today, let's ponder a few lingering questions. Questions that naturally bubble up from this deeper dive into Nietzsche's unsettling genius. First, given Nietzsche's scathing critique of philosophers' Ehrlichkeit and their often unconscious reliance on Vorurtheile, how might his own highly aphoristic style, his own sweeping generalizations, be assessed by the very demanding standards he himself proposes? Does his high-spirited attempt at self-satire, that intriguing phrase, offer him a sufficient escape route from the charge of self-contradiction? Or is he caught in his own critical net? Second, Nietzsche masterfully frames Kant's arguments as a Schauspiel, a spectacle, for discriminating spectators like us. How does this pervasive theatrical metaphor, and this very deliberate positioning of an us, who can supposedly see through the performance, affect our reading of philosophical texts more broadly? Does it inevitably lead us down a Straussian path, constantly searching for hidden esoteric meanings? Or does it push us more towards a deconstructive focus on the performativity of all philosophical language? In third, if we tentatively accept, even for the sake of argument, Nietzsche's provocative claim that philosophy often, perhaps even usually, begins with a fervent wish, an inspiration, a deeply felt intuition, how does this radically reframe the relationship between affect, emotion, embodiment, as some insightful feminist interpretations might powerfully suggest, and cool, detached reason in philosophical inquiry? Can a philosophy that openly, honestly acknowledges its inspired, perhaps even passionate origins, still legitimately lay claim to offering truth, or at least
a robust, valuable understanding of ourselves and our world. Think about those. Thank you.